Hello there. Greetings. I know a lot of people think I keep wearing the same shirt all the time. Actually, I have like 3 or 4 shirts that I wear for videos, but I actually do have more than a few shirts, believe it or not. Yeah. Keep it simple. Also, too, helps with automatic color balance, which I could actually turn off. I've actually spent a lot of time, yeah, the irony, spent a lot of time thinking about time. And space. Of course, time doesn't exist, it's only a measure. And I've said before many times that the one thing that Nikola Tesla himself railed against vociferously, nearly foamed at the mouth about, was the idea of space being substantial. All of current modern day so-called science, i.e. relativity and quantum, has reified space as something. The fact of the matter is, this is not my opinion, it's an undeniable fact, is that when you remove the ether, you have to replace a universal medium. Yeah? The medium for sound, of course, is nitrogen and oxygen. Sound's not an emission, it doesn't have a speed. Same is true of light. Nikola Tesla said light is nothing other than a sound wave in the ether. It's not an emission, it doesn't have a speed. It's a disturbance of the medium. The same is true of space. When you remove the ether, you have to replace it with something, because then the system not only becomes ridiculous, it becomes absolutely insanely impossible. So this is what relativity has done. I'm going to give you a couple quotes from Tesla and talk about what space is according to ancient metaphysicians. Say the presence of large bodies, space becomes curved, is equivalent to stating that something can act upon nothing. I, for one, refuse to subscribe to such a view. Relativity is a beggar wrapped in purple clothing of ignorant, whom ignorant people take for a king. The theory, Tesla said, wraps all these errors and fallacies and clothes them in a magnificent mathematical garb which fascinates, dazzles, and makes people blind to underlying errors. Since action and reaction are coexistent, in other words, he's basically saying the ether is the interlocutor, or the medium for action and reaction, it follows that the supposed curvature of space is entirely impossible. And this, of course, is true. Space is nothing, and it is no different ultimately than a shadow. Now, shadow is a noun in the dictionary, and we all think a shadow is something. But a shadow is not something. A shadow is an absence of something. We could say shadow, and many science fiction and fantasy things will talk about thesis and antithesis, and talk about being the shadow being the opposite of light. Shadow is never the opposite of light. Shadow, of course, is the absence of light. It's privation. Shadow is not a thing at all, even though it's a thing or a noun in the dictionary. From the aspect of true physics and true metaphysics, shadow is not a thing at all. Neither is space. Space is ether rarefaction. Space is the shadow of ether. The ether, of course, is not substantial. It is also, too, not consubstantial. Ether is not substantial. It is not consubstantial. It has neither mass nor magnitude. The ether, by definition, of course, cannot be consubstantial, nor could it be substantial, i.e. material and objective. Otherwise, it would not be the ether by definition. True definition of pure energy, for example, of course, would not be substantial. There's another term, including the word field, that no branch of science has ever defined, the word energy. They can't. That's not my opinion that they never defined it. They'll say, well, energy is the ability to do work. Well, that's descriptive of something once it has occurred, but that doesn't actually define energy. So once again, I tell you, not my opinion, fact, that no branch of science has actually ever defined the term energy. So, a shadow, of course, is the term chaos. This word in ancient Sanskrit, and also to Pali or ka, the word is denoting zero. Zero, of course, is a placeholder. In English and in Western language, 1 and 0 are numbers. In ancient Greek and in ancient metaphysics, 0 and 1 are not numbers at all. 1 is the principle, and 0 is a placeholder. So 0 and 1 at either end of the spectrum, they're actually both at the same end of the spectrum, but we don't need to go that far, are not numbers at all. And this is true of the term ke, or ka in ancient Pali, also two in Sanskrit. We have in the Greek chaos or chasm, that which is left in the wake of matter. In this case, we're not talking about matter, we're talking about the ether. So the ether is one, but of course it's the unmanifest one. That's the reason why the first two digits of the Fibonacci sequence are 1 and 1. Numbers that don't appear in the Fibonacci sequence, of course, are 0, yeah, and the number 4. 4 is only a measure, meaning time, and the only number absent in the first 5 digits of the Fibonacci sequence, of course, is the number 4. This is, of course, the reason why the word 4 in ancient Asian languages means death, because anything that suffers under the yoke of time is subject to death necessitatively, because something has a beginning in time, necessitatively it has an end in time. Space, of course, is literally samsara. I don't know if you're familiar with the word samsara, most people are. It comes from the word sams, two, a prefixual, and sarati. It literally means to go round and round, so. There's two types of emptiness spoken of in ancient Indian metaphysics, and of course India didn't exist back then. We're talking about the teachings of the Scythians of the ancient Magadha Valley, whether it be the Upanishads, the Vedas, or even the Nikayas. There is du space and there is ka space. Duha, translated literally means suffering, but it doesn't mean conventional suffering. And sukha, it would be no different than at the axis point of a clock traveling outward to where time increases and speed increases would be dukkha. Traveling inwards would be sukha. To be antecedent to both, there's a great word, antecedent, look it up. Antecedent to both dukkha and sukha would of course be transcendence. That would be the battery behind the clock. Give another clock analogy here. Clock analogy is pretty good actually if you think about it. Helps people visualize things. So two types of space, dukkha and sukha. The nave of the wheel, of course, represents counter space, sort of the ether, or the transcendence to place oneself therein, where you are no longer chasing phenomena. The space, of course, between the nave and the circumference, in the case of the wheel analogy, is that of dukkha. Space, of course, is the mirage of infinite potential, and of course called infinity. The negative image of pure potential would be pure impotency, and this is what actual space is relative to the ether itself. Space is literally a point circumference. The emptiness that exists between a point, which is not an actual point, in other words, the nexus, sort of the core of the plane of inertia, and the circumference of all objectivity and phenomena. So space is a point circumference geometry, or the hollow of a sphere. You could even say the hollow of the plane of inertia. It doesn't make any difference. So the hollow that is the toroidal formation of magnetic force divergence. What does a torus create? Magnetism is the toroidal geometry of the loss of energy or inertia of the dielectric, and that, of course, is the creation of space. What do you think fills up the volume of the torus of magnetic field geometry? So space is that resultant volume of the division of the one as against its attribute. There's a formula for this, which is my discovery, found in Plato's Republic 5:1d to 5:11. It's tattooed right here on the inside of my right wrist. It's 1 over 5 to the power of -3. 1 is not a number, of course, rather a principle. 0 is, as I said, not a number either. Rather the placeholder representing space. Sort of the volume of the 1 is manifest due to the loss of some of that energy. That some of that loss of that energy is not original sin or first cause, as far as monistic metaphysics is concerned, is the extrinsic attribute of the absolute, no different than illumination's relevance to that of light. So the magnetic torus is not a thing itself, rather the space volume generated by the loss of that energy or inertia, i.e. the plane of inertia. When work is done, something is done or made. That work, of course, has its wake, just like my DeWalt battery-powered tool equipment. Work is done, the battery is depleted, space is made in the creation of something where we actually create something of space or magnitude, or we actually cleave something depending on what the tool actually does, cuts wood, there's all sorts of different DeWalt tools to give a visual analogy of the loss of energy and inertia, which creates something and therefore creates space. And of course, this is a placeholder, the number 0. the loss of some of that energy, which of course is the creation of space. When work is done, that energy, like I said, creates a wake. And that wake, just like the toroidal geometry, is this thing that human beings are reified as something. It's no different than the way human beings reify craziness like emptiness, things that don't exist. Space, emptiness, waves. There's no such thing as a wave. A wave is not what something is, rather what something does. So, the hollow of the energy spent is, of course, the space made. Magnetism is the dielectric field, but the loss of the energy of inertia of that dielectric field, of course, is centrifugal divergence, i.e. the creation of the toroidal geometry, which is, of course, magnetism. Let's use the clock analogy again here for a quick. Everybody has like one of those cheap $15 Chinese clocks hanging on the wall like I got over here. There's a little AA battery on the back of it that you plug in, and little cheap plastic wheel that you turn. Center of clock, of course, there is no time. The battery behind the clock, which we would say analogously is in counter space. If you look at the face of the clock, you can't see the battery. You know it's back there, but don't take the analogy too far. So behind that clock, of course, is the counter space, or the ether, the unmanifest energy or potential, which would be analogous to that AA battery, which depletes, but in the case of the true absolute ether, there is no depletion, nor would that be possible. There is only centrifugal divergence and centripetal convergence. The energy re-manifests or re-entropies itself. It's never permanently lost. The hands, of course, are mass and magnitude by which they're measured to, so the passage, of course, that which we call time. The volume created by the moving hands and the expanding hands is space. It would be the negative image of the ether. It would be the volume of that clock face. We know the bubble, that plastic sheeting that's over a cheap clock anyway, the plastic sheeting over top of the clock face, the volume, which is not a thing itself. You can't bend that volume. You can literally in case of a clock space, since it's filled with oxygen and nitrogen, but that's taking the analogy too far. Obviously, zero is to number as possibility, i.e. counter space of the ether, is to actuality. What is actual is, of course, always manifest, and of mass and magnitude, which partakes of a measure which we call time. And the division of these magnitudes is the negative image of pure potential, that which we call space. But space is not a thing. You can't bend space. This is completely ludicrous. Space has no properties. Quote, unquote, Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla is right on this. Light bends around corners for the same reason that mass is accelerated towards the midpoint between the two. Midpoint between the two is the lowest pressure mediation between both. Masses never accelerate towards one another, rather towards the lowest null point in counter space, which is between the two. A shadow is not a thing at all, rather the chasm of light or potential. And in effect, of course, a privation. Likewise, too, of course, space is the chasm of the ether. Yet all of humanity and present-day so-called science, I have a PhD, we know about space warping. We all grew up with this science fiction nonsense, bending space, this. It's a reification of space is no different than a child reifying a shadow. Shadow is not a thing. Sure it is. You stand in a shadow, you feel cold. Shadow does have interesting little attributes when you're in a shadow, but that doesn't give reification to a shadow being something. It's like, well, you're not standing in the light, of course you feel colder, you can't see things, you can't read things, like walking around in the dark. This is why we reify things, human beings, one of their fundamental fallacies, reifying, creating things that don't exist. We say unicorn, which of course doesn't exist. Everybody has in their head a picture of a unicorn, obviously, even though it doesn't exist. We do the same thing regarding countless different things. There's a list of like 9 primary things that don't exist. Space, emptiness, shadows, waves. There's about 8 or 9 primary. I can't think of the other 4 offhand. You will probably remember them quicker than I can. But space is not a thing. It doesn't act upon things. It can't be bent. And it is literally no different than the volume of the torus of the magnetic geometry of magnetism, of the wake that's left from the loss of that energy. It is not a thing at all. It is the voluminous negative image of pure potential or infinity. True infinity, of course, would be counter space. Pure, pure energy, i.e. the ether, i.e. the original definition of the term inertia. All human beings are completely messed up in the head regarding space. We all think it is something, and it is not anything at all. We have the same ideas about waves and emptiness and all sorts of other ridiculousness. These are conceptual abstractions with no basis in reality in Mother Nature's universe. Space is not a thing, nor does it have properties. It has interesting attributes. It takes a long time to traverse between two bodies, like say we're doing interstellar travel between our sun and then the closest sun, which is what, Alpha Centauri. Space! We'd all be bemoaning the enormous space between the two stars, our sun and Alpha Centauri, for example. Oh my God, the long travel, so on and so forth. But it is not a thing at all. It's no different than a shadow. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions. I love reading every comment, even though it takes a really long time, actually. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely week. Lux Everetas. Goodbye.